people an inch. What do they want? Yes, they do, little bastards. Okay, so mediated transport systems use a carrier to get something across a cell membrane. That is the mediator. When I talk about mediated transport systems, I am never talking about channels. Okay, textbooks differ a little bit, so I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. Some textbooks will lump transport through a channel or diffusion through a channel in with mediated transport systems. I don't. So specifically, I am talking about a carrier. And to me, that makes more sense because isn't the carrier more involved in the process than, for instance, a channel is? Right? It has to bind. It has to change conformation. Has to change conformation again and bind again, right? So mediated transport systems are going to involve carriers. And so we saw an example of mediated transport systems before. This is one, and we're going to look at it in more detail and talk about what kind of mediated transport it is. So regardless of the type of mediated transport, what we will see is that because you are using a carrier that has shape-specific binding sites, you are going to have some special characteristics. And one of them is this. First off, before we get to this, things that have a shape-specific binding site are easily subject to regulation by other molecules, right? So couldn't I very easily, with this one, bind something not to the carrying site, but to a different regulatory site and make it fit well or fit poorly? Couldn't I, right? So not surprisingly, it's really easy to turn carriers on and off, right? So for instance, if this was an insulin-mediated glucose carrier, glucose wouldn't fit until you bound insulin. Does that make sense? Okay. So anytime anything's shape-specific, whether it's an enzyme or a carrier or anything else, it's really easily manipulated by binding of other molecules. Everybody good with that? Okay. Now, the other thing about mediated transport is that they are subject to saturation limits. If something has a shape-specific binding site, whether it's an enzyme or a carrier, it can get full. And when it gets full, its function will be limited, right? So remember that you said that basically if we looked at a situation that didn't use a carrier, as the concentration gradient went up, the transport rate would continue to go up, right? Okay, that's something that doesn't use a carrier, okay? If you use a carrier, that occurs as well. As the concentration gradient goes up, the transport goes up until you hit saturation. What is physically happening at saturation? So if you're moving something through a carrier, as you increase the concentration, the transport goes up until what? Until it's not enzymes, remember?
Substrate.
No, not a substrate, because we're not doing an enzyme catalyzed activity. We are talking about transport.
All of the allosteric sites are bound.
Exactly. So in this situation right here that we just looked at, let's say in this situation that glucose was really high outside and really low inside, right? Okay. So you had a great concentration gradient. Yeah. So 1,000 to 1 concentration gradient. But there's only one carrier, right? Can you increase transport any further with one carrier? No, it doesn't matter what you do to concentration gradient. So when your carriers are full, yeah, you can't carry anymore. That limits your rate. Does that make sense? So they are subject to saturation because they have a shape-specific binding site. They're subject to saturation. So what's the only way that you could go above here, guys?
More enzymes.
Not enzymes. Carriers. More carriers. Yes. So it's the same concept, but this is transport, not chemical reactions, right? Transport rate. And the reason it is the same concept is because enzymes have shape-specific binding sites too, right? So they're subject to saturation. This is transport saturation. Good? Okay, so this will matter. It will matter because, for instance, it will limit how much glucose you can reabsorb from your urine if you're a diabetic. Go ahead.
Is the amount of carriers on the outside of cells kind of managed so that not so much, like you were saying, not that much glucose is getting in, so you have like enzymes, for example, because you only want 10 molecules.
Yeah, it's not quick though. It's one of those adaptation and accommodation examples, right? So if you needed to change it, you would have to change it because of a consistent error signal over a long period of time, and then you would increase it or decrease it. if necessary, right? If that was homeostatic, right? Does that make sense? So it's not an instantaneous fix because A, it's protein synthesis, and B, you don't want to change the number of transporters every time you have a variable amount in the extracellular fluid, right? You would only want to change it if it was really consistent, and that would help you maintain homeostasis. Does that make sense? Okay, so they are subject to saturation. So now let's get into the specific types of mediated transport. They all use carriers, yes? Okay, all of them use carriers. You would never use a carrier if you could use a channel. Remind me why? Yeah, channels are way faster. So it should make sense to you, like we said last time, that this is going to be slower. Bind, dump, re-expose, bind, dump, re-expose, right? So this is going to be slower. So remind me what kinds of molecules I typically move through carriers. Relatively larger, not huge like a protein, but like a glucose, right? Or an amino acid, an individual amino acid, and water soluble, right? So now what I'm going to do is talk about specifically facilitated diffusion. And facilitated diffusion is simply diffusion through a carrier, right? That you would do for something that wanted to diffuse but couldn't do simple and couldn't do a channel, right? Like this example. If I just told you a little bit more detail, we could make this example specifically facilitated diffusion. If I just told you that glucose was high out here and low in here, then this would be an example of facilitated diffusion, right? Because it is diffusing from high concentration to low concentration, but it has to go through a carrier, right? Does that make sense? So facilitated diffusion does not require ATP. It only moves things down their concentration gradient. It moves the solute from high concentration to low concentration, and it is a mechanism of getting mid-sized water-soluble stuff down their concentration gradient. That's what it's doing. So that's called facilitated diffusion. In this instance, this guy is facilitating, yes, enabling diffusion. Yes? Good. Okay, so keep that in mind. We're going to come back to facilitated diffusion in a minute. So now, everybody okay with facilitated diffusion? Okay. All right, so now what we need to do is get to the next one. What if I want to move anything against its concentration gradient? I will definitely need a carrier in order to enable that, right? I need a carrier. And so in this instance, so what I will have is I have something that's high concentration, low concentration. So what we said before was if you did simple diffusion from here, right? If I just did straight simple diffusion, what would happen is that this would happen over time, yes? Okay. With active transport, primary active transport, what will happen is you take something from its low concentration and you continue to push it toward its high concentration. Does that make sense? And so with that, what you're going to do is you're going to be working against concentration gradients. You're going to need ATP when you work against concentration gradients. So in that situation, what happens is maybe I started out with a concentration gradient. If I just let diffusion work, I would even it out. But what if I worked against diffusion continually? Then can you see that if I was constantly taking things from where they tried to diffuse and putting them back to where I wanted them, then what I could do over time is maintain a concentration gradient, right? That makes sense? So you're running in place, you're running on a treadmill, just trying to stand still, because things always try to diffuse when they have the opportunity. If you want to maintain a concentration gradient, you are going to have to actively put it back whenever it tries to diffuse. But what if I want an even greater accumulation? What if I have a high concentration of sodium over here, a low concentration of sodium over here, but what I want is an even higher concentration of sodium? Then I am going to do this even faster, yeah? And then I can generate a big difference on the two sides. It will always, always be energetically expensive to do so. Because we know that when given the opportunity, any molecule, any solute, will diffuse straight down its concentration gradient. So in order to maintain a concentration gradient, you're going to need to put in a boatload of energy. So here's a metaphor for you, okay? The metaphor that works in my head for what active transport does is you are trying to accumulate something on one side of a barrier, right? Despite the fact that it's trying to move to the other side of a barrier. So have you ever seen anybody try to put a balloon bouquet in a hatchback? Right? Big old 24 balloon bouquet, right? You got it? Right? So now I got my balloon bouquet. And my open hatchback is part of the cell membrane. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to stuff it in. But every single time I'm trying, what's it trying to do? It's trying to go right back out, okay? And if you understand that the cell never gets to close the hatchback, you will understand how consistently that is going to require energy to keep those damn balloons in. And then, in the cell, all 4 windows are open, right? So you're putting it in, and it's coming back up this way, and then you're doing this, and you're putting it back in, right? And how often do you have to do that to keep those damn balloons inside your cell? Constantly for the rest of the cell's life. I'm exhausted just thinking about it, right? You would think we would all be way the hell skinnier than we are, right? Because we are constantly trying to wrangle our balloons. Okay, so primary active transport is when ions or molecules, pretty much any solute, is moved against its concentration gradient. When you move something against its concentration gradient, it needs a carrier and it needs ATP. Yeah? Now, this is important because now I'm telling you that if I want to accumulate sodium on one side of the cell membrane, then I need a carrier, even though we know that sodium can move through channels. Yes? So regardless of what you are moving, if you are moving it against its concentration gradient, you need a carrier, shape-specific binding site, plus ATP. Yes? Okay, so the net effect is that there is an accumulation of particles or balloons on one side of the membrane. It requires a carrier protein. It requires ATP. Carrier protein plus ATP is called a pump. Okay? The carrier is shape-specific. Okay? Has a binding site for the thing that you're going to move. And therefore, don't be at all surprised that you can turn carriers on and off, right? These pumps on and off. If they're shape-specific binding site, you can turn them on, you can turn them off. Okay, so now what we are going to do is go through the one that I know you've learned before, but I'm going to teach it in a slightly different way than it's usually taught. So we're going to learn the most ubiquitous pump that you have in the body is the sodium-potassium pump, yeah? And you've learned it before. It's certainly not the only pump that you have in the body. It's a great example of primary active transport, but it's not a simple example. Why the hell am I teaching you the sodium-potassium pump when a calcium pump would be easier? Because the sodium-potassium pump is on every single cell in your body. It is really, really important. It is also where you spend about 40 to 60% of your ATP. So physiologically, it's a really significant pump. So let's learn about the sodium-potassium pump, but we're not going to start with the pump. We're going to start with some true things about the cell and then figure out why you need the pump. You ready? So, and I'll show you guys an animation when we get done. So, let's start out with some stuff that you may or may not remember from 1610. I put my good black pen there. There it is. Okay, so stuff that you might or might not remember from 1610. You, of course, know that this is the intracellular fluid and this is the extracellular fluid, right? No big surprise. Does anybody remember, sometimes people memorize and sometimes people don't, the relative concentrations, just high or low, I don't need numbers, of sodium in the ECF and the ICF. Do you remember where sodium is high? Yeah, sodium is high in the extracellular fluid. And if you don't know that, it's fine. You will need to memorize it today, but it's not hard, especially if we haven't even put numbers to it yet. Sodium is relatively higher in the extracellular fluid compared to itself in the intracellular fluid. Good. And what about potassium? Where is potassium relatively higher? Yeah, high in the ICF compared to itself in the extracellular fluid. Okay, so here's what I need to tell you. This is homeostatic, meaning that you can change it, but you have to put it back. Yeah? Okay, so this is homeostatically normal for the cell. Like every other variable, it doesn't stay constant, right? But you are going to need to replace it. Now, we have a problem because some Yahoo left the sodium window open and the potassium window open, okay? You have in your cells, despite the fact that you want to maintain this, you have something that is always working against that, and this is a sodium leak channel, and a bunch of them, not just one. And when given the opportunity, which direction will sodium leak through the leak channel? Look at the concentration. It will leak into the cell and jack with this, right? Okay? And this is a potassium leak channel. There are even more of those. I'm only drawing one, but. And when given the opportunity, where will potassium leak? Yeah, it will leak out. Okay. Now, the first question that comes up to a logical person is, why the hell are those there? Who the hell forgot to close the cell windows? Well, I will get to that, but it takes like 3 more lectures to understand why they're actually important, despite the fact that they seem like they're shooting the cell in the foot. So they need to be there, so just trust me for right now, okay? But you can see that they are going to mess with your homeostatic concentration gradients, yes? Okay, so the lucky part is that there is a solution. And the solution is that you are going to use a pump. And please note that the logical person does not need me to tell them which direction you should pump sodium, do you? If this is what you want, and you are battling this, which direction do you need to pump sodium? You need to pump sodium out. Why? To maintain homeostasis, yes? Does that make sense? You gotta pump sodium back out, okay? Same question. Which direction do you need to pump potassium? You need to pump potassium back in. But in order to get sodium or potassium to move against their concentration gradient, we need ATP, yes? So every single time you use this pump, you use an ATP. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so what the pump is doing is really trying to maintain homeostasis, right? Despite the fact that you have these leak channels. Do you see? Now, how often do you have to use your sodium-potassium pump in order to maintain your concentration gradients? Constantly, or faster. Because sometimes you actually jack with this on purpose and let floods of sodium into the cell, and then you're like, what the hell? And then you have to pump faster. So you have to run, right, on the treadmill just to stay in place. If you want to go anywhere, you have to run faster still, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's look at what the sodium-potassium pump does and what it has to do with the story, and then we'll look at an animation. Okay, so here's your sodium-potassium pump. By the way, it has 3,000 different names, but they all start with sodium and potassium. They call it the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, the sodium-potassium counter transport pump, the sodium-potassium exchange pump. It's all the same pump, okay? So if it's got that, we're talking about the same one. So don't let the names confuse you. So the question I ask you, I say that sodium and potassium diffuse down their concentration gradient whenever given the opportunity through open channel proteins, leak proteins, in the cell membrane. But despite that, you manage to, over time, maintain a sodium concentration gradient of about 15 sodiums outside for every 1 inside, okay? That's sodium to itself, okay? And despite the fact that it's leaking, you still manage to maintain about 30 potassiums inside to every 1 outside. And so the question that we already know the answer to is, how can you do that? If they are constantly leaking, how do you maintain this concentration gradient over time? Sodium-potassium pump is how you maintain it, and using it constantly. So the concentration gradient, maintaining it, is due to a carrier protein that pumps sodium and potassium in 2 different directions simultaneously, called the counter transport of the exchange pump. So let us look at the sodium-potassium pump. Ready? Okay, so we're going to show you what the sodium-potassium pump does. Let me tell you just a teeny bit more about the sodium-potassium pump, and then you will be able to figure out even more about this. The sodium-potassium pump works at a certain ratio all the time, for reasons I'll explain in a little bit. Every single time the pump moves, it moves 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums in, and uses 1 ATP for the pump. Okay, so in my mind, to remember the ratios, as long as you say sodium-potassium pump and not potassium-sodium, nobody says that, right? You always say sodium-potassium pump. Then you can call it the 3-2-1 sodium-potassium pump. 3 sodiums, 2 potassiums, 1 for the pump. Got it? 3-2-1 sodium-potassium pump. Good? Okay, now, with that in mind, you can look at this animation and tell what binding sites are for sodium, can you not? Sodium, potassium, this little one?
ATP.
Yeah, ATP. Okay, exactly. So, show you what it does. Okay, so what's going to happen is, watch, we are going to have 3 sodiums bind. You are going to pop that phosphate off of ATP for the energy to move this thing, right? and then you are going to dump sodium, simultaneously revealing your binding sites for potassium. Yeah. Then how do you get potassium to move against its concentration gradient? You still have the energy that from last time, a little bit of it, but the phosphate falls off. And that's the trigger for moving potassium to the inside. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I said that sodium and potassium move simultaneously. It's a bit of a fib, right? Because they don't actually move simultaneously. You dump sodium first, but do you see that if you don't couple the movement of sodium to potassium, you can never use this pump again? So even though it's not actually simultaneous, they're so coupled that for all practical purposes, you can consider them being simultaneous. Does that make sense? So that's what this pump does. It is moving them two opposite directions, right? Both of the times they're moving against their concentration gradients. Is that okay? Any questions? So this is called primary active transport. This is an example of primary active transport. As I mentioned, these pumps are so common that you end up using about 40 to 60% of your ATP just running your pumps, especially in body systems that jack with the sodium and potassium concentrations on purpose, like nervous and muscular tissue. What those do is they massively disturb your sodium and potassium concentrations to send action potentials and cause muscular contractions, but then you have to put them back every time, right? So you know that sometimes disturbing homeostasis is expensive but necessary. Like, how do you get your blood flow up enough to work out? Well, you have to dramatically increase your blood pressure, which disturbs homeostasis, but it's serving the purpose right then, right? Does that make sense? And then you just have to put it back. So disturbing homeostasis is not always negative. You just have to put it back, right? So now, can we see, before we go any further, that by working so hard on the concentration gradients for sodium and potassium, we have set up what I will call the transmembrane potential. The transmembrane potential is the potential for sodium to move across the membrane whenever I open an extra channel. So do you see that now I've set it up so that anytime sodium is given the opportunity, I could open 25 sodium channels and sodium would quickly move which direction? Into the cell. Yes? Okay? Right? I've also set it up so that instantly I could make potassium move outside of the cell, right? We will use that to our advantage. Sometimes sodium will bring things in with it. Sometimes I will use those massive changes of sodium really quickly to send signals, right? So this is not for nothing. I have put a whole bunch of work and money in on the front end so I can get some things for free on the back end, and we will start to see what those are today. Does that make sense? Okay, so now we are going to see the first example right here. So primary active transport is just looking at any pump. This is one of them. You have other pumps. You have chloride pumps and calcium pumps and a bunch of other kinds of pumps. This is the one that you're going to see most frequently throughout the semester. Secondary active transport, this is the part that you need to listen to. This is the other thing other than osmosis that people do not tend to absorb very readily. So secondary active transport is two different transport mechanisms in series. Okay, so listen. The first transport mechanism is not active, but the second one is. So I've got two things in series, and they are this. The first one is going to be facilitated diffusion, not active. The second one is going to be active transport. Coupled together, they are considered secondary active transport. So let me show you an example. Ready? Okay, so just like I said before, the first step is going to be to bring something in. And what we are going to do in this situation is we're going to take advantage of what we just did with sodium to bring something in with sodium, because sodium wants to come in, right? Bring something in with sodium without paying for it. So here we go, and I'll show you an animation in just a second. Okay, glucose. Cell is really, really busy. How much glucose does it want? A boatload. Even if it has glucose inside, it still wants more. Now, how do I get glucose to go from glucose's low concentration to glucose's high concentration? I can pay for it directly by pumping the glucose in, yeah? Or I could piggyback it on something that was already going to come in. You with me? And that something is sodium, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring glucose in with sodium, but I can't bring glucose in through a channel like sodium would normally go in, right? It doesn't go in. A, it's not shape specific, so it wouldn't know glucose from a hole in the wall, right? And B, glucose is too big. So now, instead of moving sodium in through a channel, I'm going to use a new sodium transport mechanism. isn't a carrier. A carrier that has a binding site for sodium and glucose, and we use sodium's concentration gradient to bring something that I wanted in. Yes? Okay, the metaphor that I use for this is, you decided you were driving to Florida. Not today. Let's go to California. Florida sucks right now. Okay? Florida kind of always sucks, really. I mean, any kind of weird something that happens in the news, it happened in Florida. Somebody's face, Florida. So it's totally true. Just watch. So we're going to drive to California, and we're going to go to the beach in California, right? And we're a dude, okay? And you want to go to Florida, and this amazingly hot girl says, "Hey, I want to go to California. I want to go to California too, but I don't want to pay for gas, and I'm not going to help drive." Like, will the answer be yes? Well, if she's glucose, yes. Then the answer is yes. If she's anything else, the answer is drive your damn self or give me some money. But she is literally the hottest of all the molecules, right? Which is glucose. So what happens is glucose is binding site, sodium was already going in, you go in, because if you go to the beach, how many hot girls do you want there? All of them? All of the glucose is how many hot girls you want there, right? So glucose goes in with sodium, right? And it doesn't pay a thing, right? Sodium was already going, I already put the energy into the front end. But do you see that if you do that a few times, you're going to jack the sodium's concentration gradient, and you're going to have to pay for it on the back end? Yes? Okay, so a couple of different ways that we could do this. We could do it the more expensive way, which is to pump each glucose molecule in because it was going against its concentration gradient. Glucose ATP, glucose ATP, glucose ATP. Okay, that was 3. I just moved in. Or I could actually do glucose in with sodium, glucose in with sodium, glucose in with sodium before I had to pump those 3 sodiums back out. Do you see that I just got 3 times the glucose in for the same cost, right? Because I paid for it on the front end, and now I'm willing to continue maintaining it on the back end. Does that make sense? So this is called secondary active transport. The first step of secondary active transport was what? Facilitated diffusion with a friend. Yeah. The second step was active transport. Hence, put the 2 of them together, secondary active transport. Does that make sense? So let's look at an animation that shows you. The only thing I don't like about this animation is it doesn't show the binding site for sodium and glucose. It just looks like it's magically going through, but this is the best one I can find. Okay, ready? Okay, so what we are going to see here is this is a carrier protein. It has a binding site for sodium and a binding site for glucose, right? And it's going to bring in, he's going to show you more than 3, but it's coupling. And despite the fact that the concentration of sugar is greater in here than it is out here, I'm getting away with not paying directly for bringing the sugar in, right? That is part of the reason you put in so much work here, right? So I'm bringing in sugar despite the fact that the concentration gradient for sugar is against the direction I'm trying to go. But what's going to happen is as soon as I get enough sodium in here, I'm going to have to take care of the sodium disturbance that I created. And I'm going to do that by pumping sodium back out. And although you're showing these sequentially, they're actually happening simultaneously, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so good. So you're using the sodium-potassium pump to balance out the concentration gradient that you're messing up, right? So these 2 are coupled and it's secondary active transport. Okay, does that make sense to you? Okay, so secondary active transport is one of the reasons that you can see that you are putting in so much energy to make this happen. It's not the only one, but it's one of them. You also do secondary active transport to get amino acids into cells. Not surprisingly, if you were doing secondary active transport to get stuff into cells, the most common thing that you will try to ride with is sodium. Yes? If you were doing something to try to get stuff out of cells, the most common thing that you would ride with would be potassium because it was moving out anyway, right? So you take advantage of what you are doing is using the gradient for sodium as your energy source instead of using ATP. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about that because we were talking about how the movement of glucose is used through a carrier. You don't need to use ATP.
Yeah, here. It depends on the concentration gradient. Okay. Here you would, okay, so I see what you're saying. If glucose was high here, low here, you could move it through a carrier without ATP. But in this situation, what we've got is glucose is low here, high here, and I still want it. So what's the cheapest way I can get it in? Secondary active transport. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's like what you're talking about, even if anything moves against concentration gradient.
Yeah, if it's moving against its concentration gradient, it needs some energy source.
Okay.
In this particular situation, we're not using ATP, we're using sodium's gradient as the energy source, right? That makes sense? It's a little hard to understand that sodium's gradient is the energy source, but just think about it as the reason that you can get it to move, right? Go ahead.
And this doesn't require insulin?
No. So that question always comes up. Okay, so this is good for me to reiterate. There are 5 different ways that I know of, and I'm not a biochemist. There are 5 different ways to move glucose inside cells. There are probably 25. Because glucose is a hot girl, and you got to get her in somehow, right? You got to get her in. So there's a whole bunch. So there's insulin-dependent transport of glucose. There's insulin-independent transport of glucose. There's secondary active transport of glucose. There are different mechanisms of moving the same molecule. Okay? Everybody good? This one is not insulin-dependent, though. Okay, so could you ever use secondary active transport to move, for instance, sodium in and pop something else out? Yeah, you can, like a little revolving door. So sodium moves in, you move something else out. So FYI, you can do that. So here is sodium moving in and calcium moving out simultaneously. So all that happens is sodium binds, calcium binds, and when sodium moves, it pops the other one out. Okay? So you can use it to do countertransport as well. Okay? All right, so secondary active transport. Ultimately, sodium was used to bring glucose in without using ATP directly. That make sense? Okay, so for those of you who are organization junkies, and I know there's like at least one person other than me every semester, I want you to know that this table in your textbook, to me, I really like what it does because it compares and contrasts the different types of transport. So simple diffusion, diffusion through a channel, facilitated, primary and secondary, and it compares them by if a protein is required, what kind? Is it a channel or a carrier? Does it require energy? If it does, is it ATP or is it like using the electrochemical gradient, right? So subject to saturation, not subject to saturation. So to me, this is like a really good, like, check your knowledge. Do you actually understand how they're different kind of thing? Okay? All right. So the last 2 types of transport before I sort of let you guys test your knowledge a little bit, not with an actual quiz. We'll just do a verbal quiz. Is endo and exocytosis. So remember that the criteria that we were using is when we're trying to transport anything in the human body, we'd go the cheapest, fastest way that we can possibly get away with, right? I'm about to tell you the slowest, most expensive way. So you never, ever would do this one if you could get away with doing anything else. And you know these already. They're called vesicular transport. You learned them in 1610. They're endo and exocytosis. All I'm going to tell you about endo and exocytosis is that they are the slowest of all, and they use boatloads of ATP. Although, interestingly, we still don't completely understand how the ATP is used in the process. We just know that if you don't give them any ATP, they can't do endo or exocytosis. So whereas like with the sodium potassium pump, we're like, oh, it binds right there, it pops the phosphate off, it runs this. People are like, oh, it's totally used there somehow. We still don't know. Okay, so endo and exocytosis, you guys have met these before. Endocytosis is simply bringing big things in a bubble, a membrane-bound bubble, phospholipid bubble, right? That's endocytosis. Exocytosis is taking something and bubbling it up, usually in the Golgi apparatus, right? And then smashing it up against the plasma membrane. And because of the fluid mosaic nature of the plasma membrane, when you smash it up against the side, then the phospholipids join with the other phospholipids and you dump the contents without losing any phospholipids. Does that make sense? Okay. So if, for instance, let's do exocytosis first. I usually do endocytosis. With exocytosis, what you would do is, let's say you are a pancreatic cell and you made insulin. Yes? You made insulin. And insulin is a relatively large protein. It's not huge, but it's not tiny. It's larger than a channel. It's larger than most carriers, so you ain't getting it out that way, right? So what do? Okay, let's go back again and say, okay, if you were making a protein for eventual secretion, where in the cell would the protein have been made? Which organelle? Ribosome, specifically on the rough ER, the ones who are meant for exocytosis. So you made it on the ribosome of the rough ER, and then where did you package it? Golgi apparatus, right? Don't you have the metaphor of the factory and its little post office? And yeah, okay. So my kid's doing that right now in 7th grade. He made he had to come up with a big cell metaphor, and like he made a rap out of it. And his cell metaphor is that the cell is like the White House, but the White House right now has a viral infection. Came up with that on his own, FYI. I was like, what's the viral infection? He's like, pretty sure it's ego. Pretty sure. I was like, wow, I love you so much. Okay, so what happens is it's packaged up right there, and then it needs to do exocytosis. So you take that bubble that was packaged in the Golgi, and then you smash it up against the cell membrane. You dump the insulin into the extracellular fluid, right? Okay, so that's exocytosis. Endocytosis, there's 3 different kinds. Depends on what you're bringing in. Endocytosis, so imagine this is my cell membrane, guys, right here. My arms are my cell membrane. Intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid. This is a bacterium that I am going to try to whoop up on. I'm a white blood cell, okay? This is a coccus, right, because I'm round. So what it's going to do is it's going to do phagocytosis when you take in big chunks of stuff, right? And the way that you do that is, again, taking advantage of the fluid mosaic nature. You fold around, right? And when it joins, you bring it in a bubble. And then if you wanted to whip up on it, you just fuse it with lysosome, right? Whip up on it. Okay, so that is phagocytosis. The next one is pinocytosis. Pinocytosis is just bubbling up around something that was dissolved in the extracellular fluid. So phagocytosis means cell eating. Pinocytosis means cell drinking. Yeah? So this is just bringing in a bubble of extracellular fluid. Okay, does that make sense? So they're just small dissolved molecules. That's what it's trying to show you. And then the slowest one of all, the slowest transport mechanism that I can think of is this one called receptor-mediated endocytosis. So this one is so slow because it has to do endocytosis plus. So receptor-mediated endocytosis is the way that you bring something really specific inside the cell that can't be transported by any other mechanism. So there's certain forms of iron that you need inside cells, but they have a really hard time getting across the cell membrane. So what you have to do is you are looking for iron, which in this picture is like the purple triangles, okay? But you want to bring iron in, but you have to wait until iron binds to receptors, and not just one, because this is expensive, right? A whole bunch has to bind to the receptors, right? And then once you get it bound to X number of receptors, that's the trigger for endocytosis. Yeah? And so you bring in that bubble that is full of extracellular fluid plus whatever you wanted, right? Does that make sense? Do you see why this one is so slow? So it's as slow as endocytosis plus waiting for everything to bind to the receptor, right? So this is called receptor-mediated endocytosis. There's a couple of forms of iron that have to use this. There's a really insoluble form of a cholesterol derivative that has to use this. It's not super common, and you certainly wouldn't do it if you could get away with anything else. Okay, so now I want to see if you guys can think through some of these things. So this quiz yourself part is, I want to see if you can verbalize not just the type of transport, but in each of these situations, I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to say, how is this going to cross the cell membrane? And then, so you have to tell me the transport type. And then if a protein is used, you have to tell me whether it's a carrier, right? Or a channel, or a carrier plus ATP, which is a pump, right? Okay, so in each situation, what I'm trying to do is getting this molecule or solute to move across the cell membrane. So the first one is I'm just trying to get oxygen to move down its concentration gradient across the cell membrane. What type of transport can I use? Simple diffusion. Why? Why can I use simple diffusion in this situation? Small, cheapest, fastest way. What about oxygen allows it to really easily traverse the plasma membrane? It's lipid soluble. Small lipid soluble molecule goes straight through. Does that make sense? Okay, next one. Potassium is moving down its concentration gradient across the cell membrane. What type of transport am I going to use? Channel. Yeah. Why can't I diffuse straight through the plasma membrane? Remember, you have to defend it if you don't use the cheap, fast way. No, it's not the size. It's the charge, right? Charged molecules are hydrophilic, lipophobic. Yes? Good. Okay. And channel. And what type of transport is it? You're going through a channel, but it's blank through a channel. It's diffusion. It's just diffusion, right? Through a channel. Instead of simple diffusion straight through the plasma membrane, it's diffusion through a channel. Does that make sense? Okay. Next one. This is an amino acid moving into a cell for protein synthesis. Yes, a carrier. Okay, defend that. Why do we not use a channel? Too big, yeah? And why can't it use simple diffusion? Too big and water soluble, right? Does that make sense? You see the logic here? So you're just like each time trying to figure out why you didn't do the cheaper, faster thing, right? Too big and water soluble. Yes. Okay, everybody good? Okay, next one. A large antibody protein being secreted by a white blood cell. What kind of transport are you going to use? Exocytosis. Defend it. Why can't I use simple diffusion? Too big. Why can't I use a channel? Yeah, too big. Why can't I use a carrier? Too big, right? So this is huge and water soluble, right? Okay. Okay. This one you guys should be able to do. Water is being moved from a cell's intracellular fluid into a highly concentrated saline solution. Highly concentrated saline solution. Osmosis. Yes, because it's really just diffusion of water through a membrane, right? Okay, good. And then the last one. This one, the other class had a hard time with, so think about it for a minute. Calcium is being pumped into the calcium-rich extracellular fluid to allow for muscle relaxation. Calcium is being pumped into the calcium-rich extracellular fluid. Yeah, it's primary active transport, which it involves what kind of protein? Carrier plus ATP. Yes, exactly. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, are any of you guys thinking, I thought ions could go through channels? Why is an ion not going through a channel in this instance? Yeah, because it's going up its if you were sending anything up its concentration gradient, you have to have a carrier, regardless of size, regardless of charge, regardless of anything. And ATP, yes, carrier plus ATP. Make sense? All right, good. So this, guys, right here, this kind of stuff to me is the next level of understanding of physiology, right? And if you can not only understand my answers to this, but come up to your own, you are getting upper B to A level, right, of understanding. So instead of just telling me that that is facilitated diffusion, I can tell you why that can go through facilitated diffusion. I can defend my position, right? And importantly, the concepts aren't outrageously difficult, but your ability to verbalize them is going to be important in physiology. So physiology is not just the what's, because a lot of the what's you've already known. It's also the how's and then the why. Yes, the why is important in phys. Good? Okay. So if you can't do that yet, then it just means you've got some studying left to do, but you have about a week and a half, so you should be fine, right? Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take all of these things and we're going to put them into the context of the human body to try to figure out how, for instance, I absorb stuff from my food into my bloodstream. So you're going to use these transport mechanisms, and in each situation, you're going to try to figure out why that one versus another one. So what we're going to do is we are going to eat some Cheetos and absorb the sodium into my bloodstream. Yeah? We are going to eat a Snickers bar and absorb the glucose into my bloodstream. And then we're going to drink some water and get the water in my bloodstream. And in each situation, what we are going to have to do is we're going to have to deal with a teeny tiny bit of anatomy and then some physiology. Because, of course, when we are doing absorption, we are going to be absorbing most things from the lumen of the small intestine across an epithelial membrane, yes? Right, this is the mucous membrane, epithelial tissue. So remember, in your small intestine, do you remember what kind of epithelium it was? Yeah, it's got microvilli. It's simple columnar epithelium with microvilli. What does the microvilli do to the transport rate? Increases transport rate. Okay, so just reviewing back from anatomy, if I want to get anything into the bloodstream, what I'm going to have to do is move from the lumen, yes, across the apical surface it will diffuse just fine through the intracellular fluid, cross the basal surface, yeah? Or Phys calls it a basolateral surface, it's the same thing. Cross the interstitial fluid, and lo and behold, you don't really have to worry about getting it into the bloodstream because the capillaries behind the small intestine are fenestrated, so they've got holes. So if you get it close enough, it's going to move in anyway. Is that good? Okay. All right. So what we are going to do is we're going to use this knowledge, little knowledge of anatomy, and then we are going to use our cheapest, fastest way to try to predict how I'm going to get each of these molecules across all of those transport mechanisms. Okay. So we're going to start with sodium. Okay, plenty of sodium in all of our diets, right? Plenty of sodium in all of our diets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to eat some Cheetos and I'm going to try to get that sodium into my bloodstream. Okay, and so my questions to you are going to be, how am I going to get sodium across the apical surface? What kind of transport do you think I could use? Channel. Now, channel is right, but why do I know that a channel will work? Because what do I know about the concentration of sodium in the intracellular fluid? It's low, yes? Sodium is, why is it low? Because I'm always working on keeping it low, yes? Okay, so sodium is low in the intracellular fluid, got it? It's high because I just ate Cheetos and that lumen, not extracellular fluid, it's the lumen, right? So I'm going to move it in. What kind of transport is this? You told me it was a channel, you were right. What's the transport called? It's diffusion, it's passive, it's diffusion through a channel. You with me? Okay, so now I have it inside the cell, right? But it's not inside the bloodstream now. So now I'm going to have to try to get it out of the cell. But here I'm going to be dealing with a different concentration gradient, right? A different direction for the concentration gradient. So sodium was what in here? Low. And sodium is what out here? High. How am I going to get sodium to move against its concentration gradient? Carrier and ATP, yes. And what kind of transport is this called? Primary active transport. So you have to pump sodium out, yes, and then sodium will passively diffuse into the bloodstream, right, through the fenestrated capillaries. Does that make sense? Now, does it screw with your potassium concentration gradient? Yeah, but it doesn't really matter because potassium will just get pumped in and diffuse straight back out. Doesn't really matter. Is that okay? Okay. So do you see that, again, with just this level of memorization, just knowing where the sodium and potassium concentrations are high versus low, do you see that you actually don't have to memorize this? Right? You could actually put it together and figure it out in a pinch, which is really what I'm always working toward in Phys. And it's hard to get there sometimes, right? It's hard to be confident enough to say that that's going to be diffusion, that's going to be active transport. But it's the goal to do as little memorization as possible, because if you do as little memorization as possible, then you can always figure it out in a pinch, right? Because memorization to me, I have like a crap memory for anything that I just wrote memorized. I just don't hold on to it very long. Okay, so this is what we call epithelial transport of sodium. It is how we absorb sodium in the gut, okay? Now, let's do epithelial transport of glucose, for instance. Okay, so I ate a Snickers bar, or I ate a chocolate chip cookie. Okay, I ate a chocolate chip cookie. You know, everybody knows that the best baked goods have sugar in them and also a little salt, yes? Have you ever forgotten to put salt in your cookies? They kind of suck. They do when you forget to put salt. So there's sodium in almost everything we eat, even in the sweet stuff that we eat. We are going to absorb glucose, and we're going to use sodium as our friend to bring it in as cheaply as we possibly can. So how do I absorb glucose in the gut? Okay, ready? So I want to bring glucose in. That's my objective. And of course, how much glucose do you want to absorb? All of it if you can, right? Because we'll store it if we have excess. So even if glucose was already relatively high here, right, because I brought some in, I still want to bring it in. And I don't want to pay for it directly. So how am I going to bring glucose across the apical surface? Yeah, we're going to piggyback with sodium, okay? What is this transport called right here? It's the first step of secondary active transport, right? Okay, what kind of protein is this? It's a carrier, right? Carrier for two reasons. A, it has to have shape-specific binding sites. B, glucose doesn't fit through a channel. Yes? Okay, does that make sense? So I'm bringing glucose in with sodium. Everybody with me? Okay, let's follow glucose for a second before we follow sodium. Ready? So I brought glucose into the cell, but that's not where I wanted. I wanted it in my bloodstream, right? So now I've got glucose in the intracellular fluid, and I need to get it into the bloodstream. Let me just tell you one thing, and then you'll be able to figure out how to get glucose out. Glucose does not hang out here for any length of time. It constantly gets carried away because it's needed elsewhere. Okay, so does that tell you what you need to know about glucose's concentration gradient? So it's typically high in here because I just absorbed it and low here. Okay, so now tell me how to get glucose out. Not a channel. Can't use channel for glucose because too big. So what do I use? I use a carrier, yes. Okay, and what kind of transport is this? Diffusion through a carrier is called facilitated diffusion, yeah? So you get it out and then it gets carried away, it just gets picked up by the fenestrated capillaries. Good? Okay, now let's just go ahead back and take care of the problem that I created by bringing that glucose in. So by bringing that glucose in, it was the cheapest way I could get it in. It piggybacked with something, but it does disturb sodium's concentration gradient. How do I fix it? You pump it out. Remind me one more time. What kind of protein is that? It's a carrier, right? Carrier plus ATP is a pump. It's going to pump sodium out. You don't have to worry about what potassium does. It gets pumped back in at the same time, but diffuses out. Is that okay? Okay. Now, if you put this step and this step together, the transport mechanism is called what? Secondary active transport. Yeah. Okay. Now, you will only know it's secondary active transport if I tell you both steps, right? If you were just looking at the sodium-potassium pump, it's just sitting there doing its damn job. It doesn't know where the sodium came from, right? It's just active transport. So in order for me to trigger to you that this is secondary active transport, I have to tell you that it's a two-step process. Like I bring sodium in with glucose on the first step, and then the second step, I have to take care of the sodium disturbance. Good? Okay, so that's secondary active transport that you're using right there. Okay, so I use this same mechanism, by the way, in the gut to absorb amino acids. There is an amino acid co-transport mechanism in the gut that is linked to sodium. Does it surprise you at all? Like we're going to take advantage of sodium because we already paid for it, right? And sodium is, as we mentioned before, a really, really common way to bring something into the cell because it's going to go in anyway. Good? So we're basically getting some benefit for all of this homeostatic work that we did. Good? Okay, so the last thing is, almost last thing. Epithelial transport of water. So now I had some Cheetos. I had a chocolate chip cookie because apparently I'm just going over the wall today. I'm going to do it all, right? One day I was like, screw it. Tomorrow I'll start again. And you have those days, right? You're like, this day sucks. But now I'm going to drink some water. How do I get the water from the lumen of my intestine into my bloodstream? So the textbook picture of this just sucks. It's stupid. That doesn't mean anything to anybody. You're like, yeah, sure. But it doesn't tell you anything about the transport mechanism. So I'm going to go back to this and I'm going to say, okay, I want you guys to think about the concentration gradient that you create for water by moving massive amounts of solutes. Sodium is a good example. It's not the only one that matters, but sodium is a really, really easy way to move water because watch. So think about what we did with sodium. We moved it from the lumen to the intracellular fluid. We moved it from the intracellular fluid to the interstitial fluid to the blood plasma, okay? So now I want you to think about when I am moving sodium, what am I doing to the water concentration? As sodium moves from the lumen to the cell, the water concentration in the cell goes down, yes? And as I move sodium from the intracellular fluid to the interstitial fluid, then the water concentration goes down, right? And then as I move sodium from the interstitial fluid to the blood plasma, the water concentration goes down. Do you see what I'm doing is creating an osmotic gradient to bring water into the bloodstream? Because of the movement of all of those solutes. Do you understand?
Just because water loves salt, so just follow it?
Well, it's not so much that it loves salt, it's that when you increase the sodium concentration, you decrease the water concentration. Does that make sense? I mean, it's the same as saying it loves salt. But really, water is diffusing down water's concentration gradient. And when you change the sodium, don't you change the relative concentration of water?
The ratio.
Does that make sense? The ratio, exactly. Does that make sense? So what you're doing is creating a concentration gradient for water when you actually move sodium. Yes? So my phys professor always said that solutes suck, yes? And sodium sucks the most. Yeah. So, and that's literally the only thing I remember from phys. The rest of the time he just talked about female hormones. He was such a dog. The whole damn time. Like, yeah, it was terrible. I didn't learn a damn thing. But I did get an A. Of course, I think he liked the short shorts. I don't know. So what happens is you are creating a concentration gradient. So as solutes move, water tends to move. What is the transport mechanism that you're using there? What is it? It's osmosis, yeah. It's just osmosis, right? So water is moving down water's concentration gradient, and you are creating water's concentration gradient as you move all of these solutes, right? So let's put this back into your life. You decide having a really bad day, and you got a family-sized bag of Tostitos, and your day just blows, and there are no witnesses, and you eat the whole damn thing, right? It happens. It does happen, okay? My 18-year-old, oh my God, children eat so many chips. Like, I have to hide chips in the house. Like, everything is a single serving of chips to him. It's bizarre. I'm like, why are you not 700 pounds? So what happens is you eat all of this sodium, right? And you absorb a whole bunch of it. You can't absorb all of it, but you do absorb a whole bunch of this sodium. And the water moves with it. And then the next day, because you are no longer 18, tell me how much sodium you are actually retaining in your interstitial fluid because it hasn't been cleared from your kidneys yet. Like you're a Michelin man and your rings don't fit and all your pants shrunk the next day, right? Why? Because you move so much sodium and so much water moved with the sodium that you're retaining that water. If you give your kidneys a minute, they'll actually deplete the sodium and the water, but if you take it in that massively, they can't really keep up that quickly. So no, it's not your cells. It's all the sodium is moving. It's moving into the interstitial fluid, and then you're retaining water to balance out the sodium concentration, right? So if you eat massive quantities of sodium, what happens, right? You can't get your rings off, right? And you can't get your pants buttoned, and all of your pants were shrunk exactly at the same time, right? Of course, there are some hormonal environments that cause that to occur regardless of what you eat, and I don't need to tell any woman in here that there are certain hormonal environments that will make you retain massive quantities of water regardless of what the hell you eat. You're like, I literally ate a grape yesterday and I gained 25 pounds. I don't know how the hell this happened, right?
Is that really realistic on that time you're eating like a bag of Tostitos?
Yeah, you probably ate some Tostitos too. Maybe you put a grape on a Tostito and you're like, food. You were having a bad day. You deserve those Tostitos. Okay, does that make sense to you guys? So that is osmosis. So the way that you move water into the bloodstream is that water follows the solutes via osmosis, yes, down water's concentration gradient, yeah, and the solute that sucks the most is really sodium. Yeah, it will follow any solute, but sodium is really dramatic. And also we move tons of sodium. Okay, the last little tidbit is just to remind you that we also, of course, have lipids in the food that we eat, right? So now we know, to put this all back together with the metabolism thing, right? Generally speaking, when you eat a carb, you break it down ultimately to a simple sugar, and this is how you absorb simple sugars, primarily by facilitated diffusion. When you eat a protein, you break it down to an amino acid, and how do you absorb the amino acids? Usually by secondary active transport, kind of like you absorb glucose, right? Okay. Ions, how do you absorb ions? Well, generally, if we're talking about sodium, they're going to move down their concentration gradient by the cheapest, fastest mechanism that they can, yes? Even if you have to pump them, you will, but you would never do that as plan A. How do you absorb water? Osmosis that follows all the solutes that you just moved. Now, lipids, of course. There are lipids in the food that we eat too. That Tostitos bag is not fat-free. I don't care what it says. So how do we absorb lipids? Epithelial transport of lipids. Well, remember that basically we eat lipids. The bile salts from the liver help break them down to fatty acids or glycerol that can be absorbed. You with me? Okay, but remember that when you absorb a lipid, it doesn't go into the bloodstream at all, not directly. It goes into the lymphatic system with those blind end capillaries called lacteals. And how do you absorb fatty acids across your intestine? What transport mechanism can they use? Yeah, diffusion. They do whatever the hell they want, right? Lipids just like go straight in. You would absorb them even if you didn't want to, right? Unless, of course, you had a gallbladder problem or a bile production problem, then you can't break them down to fatty acids. You guys with me? Okay. If you can't break them down to fatty acids, you get these big non-diffusible, it's not even a word, lipids that go into your small and large intestine. And have you guys ever known anybody with a gallbladder problem? Okay, yeah. So what happens if you have a gallbladder problem, you are not treating it, and you eat a whole bunch of fats? You have gallbladder attack? How about a lot of times you get the duck squirts too, right? You're just like, it's all coming out, right? Because you don't really absorb any of those. They just like go through your intestines relatively intact. Your gallbladder like is super pissed off at you, and you like are probably going to have to throw away your underwear in public. So, so you got to plan for this stuff. You got like an extra pair, just like when you had children, right? Little bitty children. I still like, look at this. I can't bear to get rid of this. My kid is 12 now, and I just found a dinosaur in this bag the other day. I was like, oh, it's so cute. But not a pair of underwear. I don't have underwear in my bag anymore. Okay, so that is epithelial transport of lipids. Remember that the take-home message for that is that lipids go into the lymphatic system first, and because they do that, they escape surveillance by the hepatic portal system, right? So that was important as well. So they eventually will get surveillance, but only after they've been through circulation once. Okay, so last part of this set of notes is to talk about filtration. Okay, so we were just doing epithelial transport. And epithelial transport is just moving something across an epithelial membrane. And they don't talk about filtration in this chapter, but I think that filtration is an example of epithelial transport. Because with filtration, what you do is you have high pressure on one side of an epithelial membrane and low pressure on the other. And then water and solutes are moved through based on not a concentration gradient, but a pressure gradient, right? So to me, this is the place that you talk about filtration. They don't even talk about filtration at all until they get to the kidneys. But I want you to understand so that you can think about that in the context of epithelial transport. So with filtration, what you are doing is this is pressure driven, not concentration driven. Yes, you've learned about it before. So for instance, at every capillary in your body, every single one, you have fluid inside the capillary, the blood plasma, that's slightly higher pressure than the fluid that's on the outside, the interstitial fluid. And because of that, you are going to push water out of the capillary, and anything that will fit through the holes with the water will go with it. That's where your interstitial fluid comes from, right? It gets pushed out of your capillaries. So the metaphor that people usually use to make sure you understand filtration is just talking about making coffee, which was a better metaphor in Texas than it is here. And everybody's like, I don't know how to make coffee. Well, I am here to teach you. I'm a missionary to this foreign land. I will teach you about coffee and atheism and feminism and whatever you want to learn about. Okay, so ready? So when you make coffee, you know this. You've got a porous membrane that has holes of a dependable size, right? And basically what you're going to use is pressure to bring fluid and anything that will fit through the holes, right? It's not selective about what it brings through, because if you put dirt in the coffee filter, the little particles of dirt are coming through too, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to pour water in, and the fluid is going to pull anything that fits through the holes. And if you increase the pressure, you could pull bigger things across, yes? Or if you increase the hole size, you could pull bigger things across. That makes sense? Now, it's not concentration driven, because even though it seems stupid to say, if I had grounds in the coffee carafe, it would still bring the particles through, because it doesn't care about concentration. It's only pressure driven, the pressure differential. Does that make sense? So could I put huge whole things like Cheerios through a coffee filter if I increase the pressure? Yeah, I totally could. I could put a bowling ball through a coffee filter if I increase the pressure enough, right? But only once, right? You would destroy the membrane. This is why when we talk about filtration, it ends up being really important that you talk about hypertension. Okay, so the kidneys are pressure driven, yeah? They do filtration based on a pressure differential, and you're really concerned about the pressure differential between your blood and your urine, ultimately. Does that make sense? Okay. And your urine should be relatively low pressure. There's no pump hooked up there, and you're constantly getting rid of it. but your blood is relatively high pressure. Now, in a person with normal blood pressure, there's going to be enough of a pressure differential that you lose small solutes, you lose water, but you get to hold on to your red blood cells and your important proteins. Does that make sense? But now let's talk about a person with untreated hypertension. What's going to happen with a person with untreated hypertension is the pressure differential is greater, and you can lose big proteins that you meant to keep and whole red blood cells into your urine. And think about the damage that is occurring to your filtration membranes in your kidney as you're doing that. You're basically hooking up a fire hose, right, behind your coffee filter. And can you understand why long-term associated with untreated hypertension is very often kidney failure? Does that make sense to you guys? So filtration is pressure-driven. It's not concentration-driven. It is not an active transport mechanism, meaning that no ATP is required at the site of transport. Now, ultimately, you can say, well, ATP was required to make the pressure differential, but you're not requiring it at the site of transport, right? So no ATP is required. Large things like proteins and whole cells couldn't cross, but small things will go with the fluid, right? So it's always going to require water to be moving, and small solutes will move with it. So in the kidney, it is blood pressure that forces the filtration difference, right? Blood pressure. Okay, so elsewhere in the body, you're also moving water and small solutes from the blood into the interstitial spaces. So you guys understand kind of what the kidney is doing? So let's talk just for a second about urea, and then we're going to tell you how dialysis works. Urea is a waste product from what metabolism? Do you guys remember? Protein metabolism, yeah? It's a waste product from protein metabolism. You get rid of it primarily at your kidneys. It's water soluble. It's relatively small. It moves out primarily by filtration through the holes, right? And as long as you don't start building up excessive amounts of urea in your bloodstream, you're fine, but your kidneys are always moving it out by filtration, okay? Now, if you start building large quantities of urea in your system, it's going to change your pH and change the structure of your proteins, change the shapes of your proteins. So what will happen with a person, for instance, with kidney failure is that they'll start to get buildup of urea in their system. Does that make sense to you? In their bloodstream. So when you have kidney failure, you will start to get buildup of waste products. Let's just concentrate on urea because you guys know where urea comes from. You could do this with other things as well. So if your kidneys start failing you, instead of depending on your own kidney filtration, you might choose to do dialysis. And this is a specific form of dialysis called hemodialysis. So with dialysis, here's what you're going to do. My kidneys are failing. My blood is funky, right? I've got too much urea in my bloodstream. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to either I have a dialysis machine at home if it's really bad, or I'm going to go to a dialysis place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out my blood from one side, and then I'm going to run it through the dialysis machine and then put the blood back in. And I'm going to cleanse it in the process. Does that make sense? Okay. And sometimes they go out one arm and into the other, and sometimes they do the same arm like this. So how does this work? What it does is you are going to run it through the dialysis machine, but there's a chamber inside the machine, a disposable chamber. And this chamber has a really, really curved membrane down the middle, way more curved than this. I have one in my office. I just forgot to bring it. Super duper curved membrane. And what's going to happen is you're going to run one fluid by one side of the membrane and another fluid by the other side of the membrane. So what I have is I've got my blood, right, which has a high concentration of urea, among other things. And I'm going to run that through this direction. Does that make sense? Okay. And then I'm not going to dump my blood, of course. I'm going to put it back to the body. Okay. And then I am going to run a solution on the other side. And this solution on the other side, I'm going to do countercurrent. Do you guys remember that you get better exchange when things are running different countercurrent multiplier? Okay, so on this side, I'm going to run what I call dialysis solution. Yes, dialysis solution. And the dialysis solution, let's talk about it before I tell you all the details about it. So this membrane, you can engineer it to control what it's permeable to. It is definitely permeable to water, or else you wouldn't be able to do very much. Like the fluids wouldn't even interact with one another. Since it's permeable to water, I better make the dialysis solution what tonic to my blood? Isotonic, yeah, it has to be an isotonic dialysis solution, right? And if I want to move urea, I better make it permeable to urea, yes? So it's permeable to urea. So I've got a high concentration of urea over here. How much urea should I put in the dialysis solution? None. Yeah, that's the right amount. 0. I'm going to say low concentration, but there is no urea over here, right? Okay. And then as long as I make the membrane permeable to urea, as I run the high concentration urea blood this way and the low concentration urea dialysis solution that way, which direction is urea going to move? It's going to move out here, right? Urea is going to move out there. And then what am I going to do with this? I'm not going to recirculate this. I'm going to dump it. And every single round, I'm going to put in fresh dialysis solution that has no urea in it. So it's not circulating. You're dumping the dialysis solution. Do you see? Use dialysis solution. Okay. So what this does is, of course, it's cleansing your blood. It's not cleansing your blood the way that your kidneys do, because your kidneys cleanse your blood of urea primarily using what mechanism? Filtration. This is not filtration, though. What is this? Yeah, it's just diffusion. It's based on diffusion. It's not pressure differential that moves anything. It's just concentration gradient that moves it. Does that make sense? So this is hemodialysis. If your kidneys were still okay, but not great, you might only have to do it like once a week or once every 2 weeks. When your kidneys are really, really failing, you can have to be on dialysis for like hours and hours every day. Sometimes like even the entire time you're sleeping every day. You can have to be on hemodialysis. That is generally not a good sign. It means that your kidneys are not doing a damn thing, really. So you can also, there's a couple of different other kinds of dialysis. I don't quite know how this one works. There's one called peritoneal dialysis, in which they do it in the peritoneal cavity. And it ends up cleansing of urea. I don't quite understand how that one works, because I can conceptualize a high concentration of urea in your bloodstream. I don't know why the hell it would like work in here. So I'll have to look it up at some point. If one of you guys knows, you can teach me. It'd be easier than me having to read it for myself. What am I? Okay. So you guys all right with dialysis? Okay. All right. So now let me just tell you a preview of things to come. So the next set of notes is membrane potentials and action potentials. And I'm not going to get into it today because it's not a short story. But membrane potentials and action potentials are, I start from this point right here, and you have to know this stuff in order to get there. And then see if you can conceptualize that if I move ions in and out of the cell at different rates, can you imagine that I might be able to make the cell be positively charged on one side and negatively charged on the other? Does that make sense to you? When you have a cell that's positively charged and negatively charged, one side versus the other, and then you move ions across it even further, what you do is you create a voltage change, right? So in this next set of notes, what we're going to do is we're going to build from this to learning how electrically active cells work. So we're going to be basically talking about nervous system transmission and muscular system transmission and action potentials. If I were you, I would not miss these next 2 lectures. For me, this was very difficult for me to understand on my own. Like, you're smart enough that you could probably understand anything on your own if you read it 72 times, but you could also listen to me talk about it for an hour and a half instead of reading it 72 times. Okay? So that's next Tuesday. You have a quiz over this material. So Tuesday and Thursday we'll do this, and then your test will be the Tuesday following. Note to self, I don't know if I told you guys this, you will have a take-home quiz next weekend. I generally do these right before a test. Take-home quizzes are open book, and they have a different purpose than quizzes in class. Quizzes in class are you studying regularly? Take-home quizzes are, can you use your resources to figure out more complex topics? Do you know where to find things? Do you know what kinds of questions to expect? They're not super long. There's still only 12 or 15 questions, but it gives you the opportunity to sort of assess how your knowledge is before you have a test. That make sense? Okay, I will see you guys on Tuesday.